Hi, Helen. Hang on a sec. It seems to have muted you. Are you able to hear me, Helen? Right. I can't seem to get it off muting you. Let me just see. There we go. Is that working now? Yes.
You can hear me?
Yes, I can. Sorry, I'm really not very good at this stuff, so I'm just learning on the job.
One is.
So there's a few people in the waiting room just because the invite was a bit confusing, I think. But I'll let everyone in at 2 o'clock.
Yes.
I've got a copy of your slides on my computer as well, but I've also given you permission to do share screen.
Good, yes. I've changed it very slightly.
Okay.
I mean, it doesn't make any difference, but I'll use mine if I can.
Great. Okay, so yeah, it should just be a case of on your bottom of your screen, there's that green button that says share screen, but anything beyond that, and I can't really,
Okay.
I can't really help, I'm afraid. But yeah, that should be good. And we've got quite a mix of people coming. Some of the team up at Leeds University who are doing some of the research. Yeah, I saw you're down as part of the advisory group there as well. Yeah, great. And Nick Shaxson, who is really interested in financialization and is sort of putting together a film about financialization in different sectors.
Oh, good.
He's joining. And then we've got people from women's movement, from NGOs, from some of the children's charities as well, and from the Human Rights and Qualities and Human Rights Commission as well, as
Good.
a few kind of individuals who are interested. So I don't know exactly where the discussion will take us, but I'll try and share a little bit and see what comes from it. But the slides looked brilliant, so I think it'll be a really interesting session.
Okay. Can't see you, by the way. Does that matter at this time?
Oh, do you know what? I've got my video switched off, that's why. There we go. Is that now working? My goodness me. I know this is the future, but I just find it really tricky. Right, I'm going to start letting people in. Hi there, and thank you for your patience, people who've been in the waiting room. I'm sorry, I'm quite new to making Zoom things happen, and so I built myself in a bit of time to get the tech working, but obviously that's translated into the invite. So I hope we managed to give you half an hour of your life back rather than just waiting for the screen to move on. We're expecting to start at 2, so we'll just let people come in now, and then we can kick off.
Can I ask a question, Lucy?
Yes, of course.
Is this being recorded?
It is being recorded, yes.
Is it being recorded visually as well? It's just that we are making a documentary film and might request possibly items. We can discuss that later. Okay, thanks.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, we could definitely have that discussion afterwards. Let's see where the discussion goes and things, and then yeah. Have to keep my eye on the waiting room. Oh my goodness, I think next time I'm going to have to get some kind of cool slides or soundtrack for this. Learning as we go.
Oh, there's somebody at the door. I'm just going to nip out.
Okay.
Put painters in.
So whilst everyone's here, and to fill the dead space, we've got about 20 people sort of registered to come into the session today. So I wasn't going to do a go around for everyone to introduce themselves to each other. But if you want to use the chat box, just to let people know who you are or what your particular perspective or interest is, that would be really helpful. And that might be something to get started on now if people want to, just so that people get a feel for who's here. Thanks. Hi, Helen. We're just giving people a few minutes to join, and then I'll do proper intros. But I was just saying to people, if you want to use the chat box to introduce yourself to others, that would be great. We're not going to do a big go round because we've got a few too many people, at least a few too many who are registered. We'll see how it goes with everyone turning up.
Well, I saw Kate was here from Leeds, so
yes.
Speak to Kate.
Yeah, I think quite a few of our colleagues are coming as well. We've got two in here already.
Well, you've got together your team quite quickly. for the research, Kate?
Yeah, luckily we've got quite a lot of good postdoctoral researchers in the department who are ready to go. So we're quite lucky in that regard, yeah.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us. We're just going to give people a couple more minutes to log in. Whilst you're joining, we're not going to do a go round with introductions by everybody, but if you want to use the chat box to let people know who you are, that would be brilliant, and a way to fill the space of silent Zooms. Okay, I'll give people just a minute or so more. Hi everyone, so for those of you who've just joined, we're just going to wait one more minute for anyone else to log in, but if you wanted to use the chat box just to introduce yourself to everyone else who's on the call, that'd be great, because we're not going to have time to do a go around, so it's a chance just to see who else is here, or to let people know who you are and the work that you're doing. Alrighty, I think I'm going to get going, and then if people join us, I'll add them in as we go along. So welcome to the first of our Zoom series on childcare campaigning. It's great to see you all here. Thank you for putting up with being in the waiting room for too long for some of you. Because time is limited, like I said, we're not going to do a go round of introduction, so do use the chat box to connect with other people. Just quickly, I'm Lucy Stevens. I work at NEF, and I've been working on childcare for the last 3 years at NEF, both in a practical sense, working with parents in Deptford in Lewisham to set up a new parent-led nursery, which opened last month, and also at a policy and research level. And we've put out some publications in the last 12 months around quality childcare for all, and more recently, the Childcare Infrastructure Fund, as a costed policy to save and reform the childcare sector during COVID. NEF sees childcare as critical social infrastructure that can both tackle childhood inequality and enable parents, and especially mothers, to make choices about how they balance their caring and employment roles. And we all know childcare is in crisis, and that crisis has been compounded by COVID. So in an effort to recognise the work that so many people have been doing over the years to campaign for better childcare, we've set up these sessions as an opportunity to learn from the work that's already been done and to develop our own thinking for a new campaign for better childcare for all that puts the voices of children, parents and childcare workers at the centre of the conversation. So just to give you a really brief sense of the structure for today's session, in a moment, very excitingly, I'll be introducing Professor Helen Penn, who's today's speaker. Helen's going to share some slides, and while she's presenting, I'll make sure everyone's on mute, just so we can really concentrate on what she's sharing. But the chat box will remain open all the way through her presentation, so do post questions there during her presentation. Then at the end of Helen's slides, we'll have 15 to 20 minutes for a discussion. I'll obviously share with Helen any questions that have already come through the chat box, but also do raise your hand if you want to ask a question directly, either with the Zoom electronic hand if you're a whiz at it, or just wave at me and I'll try and spot you as well. If we don't manage to cover all of the questions during the session, then do email me directly afterwards and I'll try and get a response to you. And just so everyone knows, we're recording the session at the moment because there were some people who weren't able to attend who wanted to be able to see it as well. So just so you know, it's on record. After today's session, I'll also share the details of subsequent sessions because we've got 3 or 4 other sessions coming up which are on the same theme with lots of different perspectives being represented, including sharing insights from organising with childcare workers in Ireland, developing a new union for unregistered home-based childcare workers, learning from parent-led campaigns against nursery closures and school cuts. So there's a real kind of range of knowledge that can be shared through these sessions coming up. So let's get started. Our speaker today is Helen Penn. Helen has been active in all aspects of early years, from training and working as an infant teacher, working for local government as a social worker, and Assistant Director of Education, through to research and as an academic. She's also a writer and campaigner and a founding member of the National Childcare Campaign, which I've got down as being established in 1978, Helen, but you may correct me on that. She's now based at UCL's Institute for Education, and a key part of her work has been looking at the childcare market. And Helen's going to share with us some of her recent work looking at the state of childcare in England and what that means for children, parents and childcare professionals. So over to you, Helen.
Okay, thank you. I'm very pleased to be here. I've been asked to look at 4 things. How the sector's changed over the years, what the implications of these changes are for childcare professionals, what difference COVID has made, and what we could learn from previous campaigns. But before I show my slides, I'd just like to make a few introductory remarks, mainly about the EU. If you look at the EU or the OECD, they have frameworks for policy, strategy, and delivery of early childhood education and care, which I will now refer to as ECEC for shorthand. And they're impressive. There are long discussion papers about the economics of childcare, about the necessary criteria for achieving a good system which all children and families can easily access, about standards of ECEC, about how they might be monitored and evaluated. And the EU monitoring system for education, Eurydice, is just wonderful. It's a treasure trove of information about services across Europe. And crucially in the EU, there's concern about childhood itself and children's rights, what makes society happy, what makes children happy, and how it might be afforded. This time next week, I'm going to be at a virtual seminar in Europe convened by my colleague Michel Vandenbroek from Ghent University about his new book on the great South American educator Paulo Freire and his relevance to early years practice. I'm not sure now that anybody really remembers who he is, at least in the UK. But at this European launch, experts from all over the world, excluding the UK, will actually be discussing not rules and regulations, but theory. That is, ideas about how young children could be brought up and what the adult's role in the process might be, and how we can reflect and improve on how we interact with children in group settings. That kind of discussion seems to me to have largely vanished from the UK. And it's the range and comprehensiveness of the EU and OECD policies, and the fact there are so many good examples of good practice across Europe, that gives me some kind of hope that there are alternatives to what we currently have in the UK. I think we have a highly insular and failing system, and we seem not to be able to learn from positive examples elsewhere, and Brexit will only make it worse. I don't think everything in the garden's lovely elsewhere, but I think that the UK's fallen on very hard times indeed. We're failing to recognise how good we were, especially for education, and we're failing to recognise how bad we are in achieving what is normal in other places, that is an integrated, high-quality early education and childcare system. As somebody who once campaigned for good childcare and thought nurseries were good places for young children, I now have doubts about letting any child use a day nursery. And in fact, my grandchildren don't. So I'm going to now just go through my PowerPoint very quickly. If the share screen works. Here we go.
Shall I put it up on? Oh, there we go. Great.
Yes. Now, how am I going to get this into full? Oh dear. I'm afraid you'll have to forget the side bits. I can't see on this how I might get rid of them. Oh no, here we are. No. Well, this is what I'm going to talk about. What's happening in the EU, what's happening in the UK, what the implications for childcare professionals are, COVID, and what we can learn from previous childcare campaigns. And I'll just talk about the EU, because the EU has, quite some time ago, adopted a proposal for high quality early childhood education and care systems. And it has all sorts of resources available to help member states or even ex-member states improve access to and quality of their early childhood education systems. So they've got a quality framework, and it stresses these things: access for all to early childhood education and care, all sorts of information and suggestions about training and working conditions of staff, definitions of appropriate curricula and governance, which go way beyond anything we currently do, adequate funding, i.e. around about 1% of GDP, and some very sophisticated monitoring and evaluation systems. So that's what's available elsewhere. Now, in my study, which is called Acquisitions, Mergers and Debt, the New Language of Childcare, we've been looking at the current situation in the UK. And in particular, we've been doing forensic accounting. That is, we've been looking in some detail about how childcare companies spend the money that they get from government and parents. Now, most formal childcare in the UK, over 80% of all places, is provided by the private sector. And the private sector includes something like 9,000 very small private operators to multi-million-pound international businesses, and 53% of all childcare places are provided by those big companies. So the for-profit childcare market in the UK is worth about £5.5 billion, of which the majority comes from government and the rest comes from parent fees. Of that money, 3.6 billion goes to those very big companies. The largest three chains between them, providing over 60,000 childcare places, are owned by foreign investors, with financial head offices located in Singapore, France, and the USA. And as we'll see, further changes in the sector seem likely, most notably increased penetration by large chains and increased foreign investment. So corporate childcare or nursery chains now provide more places than small private operators, but it's a very volatile sector, typified by continual mergers and acquisitions, with larger companies continually buying up smaller chains. And the trade magazine, Nursery Chain, ranks the top 25 childcare companies with the most number of settings and places. In 1998, there were 70 companies listed. By 2018, this has gone up to 179 companies. In 1998, the combined number of places in this sector was 33,506. By 2018, the top 25 companies alone were offering 110,000 odd places. And the largest company, Busy Bees, was offering 31,500 places. So that's the scale of the companies. Now, this whole question about investment is very interesting. Childcare in this country is actively promoted as an international development. And if you look at this chart, which has been done by the organisation Christie's, which is basically a property company, they're showing lines of inward and outward investment in childcare in the UK. I mean, it's just staggering. So if we just break that down a bit, all these companies work in other places besides the UK. So Busy Bees all over the place, Child Base in China, Cognita schools in South America, kangaroo pouch nurseries in England and China. China's a very popular destination. And the Middle East increasingly is going to be. Nurseries in England and the United States, and more nurseries in China. But if you look at it the other way round, these are international childcare firms. That is, their organisation is completely outside this country, but they operate in this country. So the biggest of them is Bright Horizons, which I'm sure you've come across. So their biggest contingent is in the US, but they're investing heavily in England. The fastest growing company is called Les Petits Chaperons Rouges, which is a French company. There's another French company called La Maison Bleue. There's an Icelandic company which is investing increasingly heavily in Scotland. And there's a Chinese company which is buying up nurseries in Southampton. So there's all this to and froing, which means, of course, it's incredibly difficult to track the governance of these countries, who's doing what, who's held accountable, and so on. We looked in our Nuffield study at the extent of, apart from the accounts, we looked at the extent to which companies took any notice of low-income, disadvantaged families and children. So we did a keyword search of company literature and trade journals, and we didn't pick up any mention of issues like social impact and responsibility, access for vulnerable marginalised groups, fairness, participation, accountability, etc. And it became very clear from our research that parents who can pay without any problems are the best customers for private nurseries. There is considerable evidence to show that big companies avoid, if they possibly can, taking on low-income or vulnerable families. Now, why is there all this buying and selling in the childcare market? Well, private equity companies with offshore headquarters and using shell companies have been buying up nurseries as a profitable investment. And in fact, most of the big companies are owned by, in the last resort, by private equity companies. But despite all the buying and selling and the expansion of these big companies, there's been no overall increase in places. That stunned us. Big companies swallowing up little ones, but very few new places as a result of all the mergers and acquisitions. In the course of acquisitions, i.e. buying up smaller companies, the buyers incurred debt, considerable debt. They borrowed money to buy, but this debt was used to offset taxes. So it's quite good on your records if you have very heavy debt, because you then don't pay tax, a bit like Trump. So even though there was considerable debt, at the same time, companies were continuing to pay shareholders at returns of anything up to 16% per annum. Now, this process of acquisitions, mergers and debt is called financialization, and it's very common across privatized companies. As I'm sure some of you here will know, childcare is only one example of corporate takeover or acquisitions. Now, what are the implications for staffing of this financial model? Well, the model of staffing in childcare companies now tends to be apprenticeship-based, employing very young, unqualified staff to do basic caring tasks, accompanied by a policy which may or may not be good, of training and internal recruitment, leading to managerial positions. Basic staff are low paid, but at managerial level it may be better paid if targets are met for achieving company goals, in particular meeting profitability goals. Nuffield also funded a recent companion study on childcare workers, which also showed clearly that workers are very low paid, with a sizable proportion earning less than minimum wage, poor contractual conditions and poorly qualified. And the Christie survey, which I showed you the slide from early on about international investments, suggested, so not even a government survey, a private sector survey, suggested we have the lowest level of qualification in Europe. Well, what are the COVID implications on this company childcare scene? Well, it's unclear, of course. The childcare industry is obviously badly affected, but mergers and acquisitions are continuing. Private equity companies, where they can, are taking advantage of the situation by buying up small nurseries at rock bottom prices. And if you look at Nursery World or one of these other trade magazines, you can see accounts, items about these takeovers. There's also been diversification, so Bright Horizons now are specialising in offering home-based solutions, whatever that means, for childcare. And then, very shockingly, the government says it spends 3.8 billion on childcare and early education through a myriad of different funding streams that are hard to track. But a very recent report in Nursery World, I think a week or two ago, says there's been an underspend of 1.6 billion on childcare subsidy. And although this predates the pandemic is likely to have increased the underspend. So, you know, this money has been set aside to help poor, low-income parents get childcare, and it's largely unspent. Because it's so difficult for the parents to access nurseries. And what has happened also with COVID, as I'm sure you know, is that there's much more focus on working mothers and their childcare needs. And that's led people, I think, to just want to keep the existing situation from getting any worse. But, you know, the flip side of that is it could hardly get any worse. It's so bad already. So I was asked to make some campaigning recommendations. So what I would say, and I say this with difficulty because I know there's campaigns like the Force campaign, don't pursue the status quo. We don't want the situation restored. Any campaigning should be attached to new childcare solutions, not restoring existing inadequate systems. And although it would be my preferred solution, it's probably impossible now to revert to state-controlled, state-provided solutions, despite the fact we've still got so much nursery education in schools. I would like to see that nursery education built on and extended, but that's a very hard case to make. So I think we could consider a grant funding mechanism to nurseries rather than individual subsidies to parents, because it then gives you much more control over what the nurseries do. And for the nurseries, it means they get a much more predictable income and they're not dependent on attracting the most robust payers to their nursery. So if we did have some kind of situation where we could support community initiatives or give childcare supply side funding, how would we structure it? Well, these suggestions really are taken from Norway, where there is a very large private sector, but where the controls on the private sector are quite stiff. So each nursery, whether part of a group or acting alone, must show accountability. They must produce annual plans for each nursery, which must be agreed by staff and parents, and in some cases even children. What is common throughout the OECD countries is the introduction, not just Europe, is a fee ceiling related to household income. So no parent should pay more than, say, 15% of household income. Nurseries should have quotas for vulnerable children. You should never be able to turn away children who need the provision most, but that in effect is what's been happening. You need to increase the proportion of qualified staff if the nurseries to be grant eligible. And then I think we should broaden the monitoring arrangements. I mean, one of the sidelines of our study was to look at what Ofsted monitored and how accurate their monitoring was. And quite apart from the whole notion of the curricula and the guidance and so on, which I think is badly in need of revision, Ofsted don't really include adequate information or any information at all about ownership structures. So you would never know anything about these companies if you just looked at the Ofsted returns. We looked at a stratified sample of Ofsted returns, and really they told us so little, and they were so undemanding. And then this is a particular obsession of mine, but I think one of the ways in which the curricula should change, absolutely should change, is to do with nature and the environment in the curriculum. It's minimal now. It should be an absolutely central, monitored part of the curriculum. And what I find really shocking is that currently nurseries can register without any direct access to outside space. I think there are something like 1,000 nurseries in London which have no outside space and are located directly onto main roads or unsuitable outside premises, just in London. So I think the idea of cooping up young children in a very small space and not allowing them to play outside naturally seems to me horrific. That's partly why I object to nursery provision so much, apart from nursery education, and that's something that's come in the last 10, 15 years. So I think we certainly need to tighten up on all our environmental regulations for nurseries. So there are some of my suggestions. I don't know how realistic or otherwise they are. I'd like to think that they could be achieved, but anyway, that's it. So there's a very brief overview, and I'm happy to answer any questions about any of the things that I've said.
Thank you so much, Helen. That's brilliant. If you're able to stop sharing your screen, that would be great, and then we'll be able to see everybody. And there's a lot to take in there. And for some people, I know, I can see Sarah, a colleague of mine, on the call as well. And Neff has also been working on adult social care for a number of years. And there are some real common themes across the two. And perhaps it would be fair to say that childcare is a little bit behind quite how bad things have got in adult social care. So we might still have time to turn away from that end point. But there's a lot to kind of to pay attention to there as well. So in terms of questions, if anyone wants to raise a hand or post something in the chat box, go for your lives. So Xanthi is asking if we can have a copy of the slides and some links and references to the reports. Helen, this has been an ongoing conversation with us for a while because your report's not yet published, is it? What do you have a publication date yet?
We've had terrible trouble with this report, not because it's inaccurate, I don't think it is, but Nuffield and UCL between them are having legal kittens. I mean, it seems, you know, our accountant, our forensic accountant's furious because he says, as you just said, that these things are commonplace. It's happening in every sector. But for people to understand that it's also happening in the childcare sector has been very bad, very, very difficult. And we've had no end of objections to the report. So we've been over it again and again and again and again. And I hope it's in its final iteration and it should be out next month. But I've said this before. But it will be published jointly by UCL and Nuffield.
Great. Great. So Dara is asking if we know the percentage of state spending versus parent spending.
Yes. All in all, you know, it's terribly difficult to track all these funding streams. I mean, there are dozens of them. But very roughly, about 5.6 million goes into childcare and early education, both of them. And the government says it puts in 3.6 million of that.
Billion, is it? Billion rather than million.
Billion,
yeah.
Of course it's billion, yes, sorry, 3.6 billion. And, but as we've just seen, the government aren't spending their share. So 1.6 billion is apparently not yet spent.
Mm.
It's just amazing. I don't think it's COVID. I think it is all sorts of barriers that put up, not least by the nurseries, to taking on parents who can't pay.
And the complexity of the system to claim as well. Christine is just asking, curious as to what makes childcare such an attractive investment for these private equity companies, given that it's quite a labour-intensive, low-margin activity. Where are these excess profits being extracted from? Is it purely a case of financial engineering?
Yeah, that's what it is, financial engineering. It's through the acquisitions and mergers and debt. You know, it's a service which is continually being sold on. And as it's being sold on, people, you know, extract some kind of profit from it. But it's not, I mean, as you say, it's far worse in adult care. I mean, all the scandals about the care homes are to do with this kind of financialisation. It's a sort of, in a sense, it doesn't matter too much what the service is. If you can manipulate it and get money out of it, then that's what you do if you're a private equity company.
And Nick is asking actually if he can ask a question, and I suspect it's along that theme as well. So over to you, Nick.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, great presentation. Can I just, so it's really a comment rather than a question. I'm very big into silo crossing. I think it's in my work between different sectors. And what I mean, I've been looking recently at the care home sector, not
Yeah.
so much the childcare sector. But what I see is things going on there, led by private equity companies. It's not all private equity companies, but private equity companies are a kind of distillation of the things that are going on. And there's a whole kind of bag of tricks there that are being used, not just in this sector, but in pizzas, in electronics, in tourism, in all the way across the economy. And if we're thinking of a campaigning strategy, it seems to me to make sense to try and start building alliances with people in very different areas who are coming up against the same sort of things. Because what's happening, these are wealth extraction devices. These tricks that are being used. They're tax tricks. There are tricks related to real estate, all sorts of other things. That are being used to suck money out of the system. And when you suck money out of the system, you make life harder for everybody in the system. But these same tricks are being used to suck money out of lots of other systems. And yeah, it's just a kind of general comment. I think it might be interesting to start thinking about how we campaign on a broader level, and who we join up with, and where's the common ground? Because I think there's a lot more sort of power and force if we join together with other people in other silos. And I think a lot of people in other silos really have no idea what's going on. They're sort of generally sense in their gut that something bad is going on, and they're being extracted from. And there's a lot of popular anger about that. But I think making these things explicit and explaining how they work, I think, is a very useful way forward.
Thank you, Nick. I think that's a really good a good nudge for us as well, to make sure we're talking about a narrative that explains this as a process under which any sort of service or anything else could be existing, rather than it being purely a problem.
Well, I'm sure, as Nick knows, there's already a lot of work going on in this area, both by academics and non-academics. There's plenty of stuff around which can be brought together.
Yeah,
it would be a good idea to campaign more on it. I mean, I'm so shocked by the care home scenario during COVID. I mean, the fact that there were so many 0 hours workers going from place to place, not daring to stop work and spreading the disease, is just a result of this terrible situation. And yet hardly anybody called out the financialization of the care sector as being a problem. It was that the government didn't give enough money to the care sector or whatever. I mean, the care sector's got such a lot to answer for, like all these financialized sectors.
Yeah, it feels really important at this point in time as well that any call for a change for childcare is not simply we must have more money, because in the current setup, pouring more money in will just potentially see more of it leak away into pockets here and there, rather than actually seeing either the quality increase, the pay to workers increase, or the fees to parents go down. So that there's that question of just more money is nowhere near enough. We've got a question also then from Helen, who is asking, with the work you've been doing, do you have any insight on what impact the changes to the group settings is having on childminders and other at-home childcare provision? And is that form of care also in decline due to the rise in larger chains and the mergers and things? And I think I remember you also talking a little bit about some of the care platforms that are coming through from some of those big chains as well.
Yes, well, I don't, our study didn't include home-based care, but I know that it's been shrinking. And I know that the voluntary sector generally has been shrinking. But I couldn't answer with any kind of authority about what's been happening to the sector. It may be that under COVID it's grown a bit. I know that I was looking after my grandchildren, throughout the lockdown. So I'm sure there have been all sorts of home-based solutions that people have drawn on.
Yeah. And we are going to have some sessions also on home-based care, both kind of formally registered, but also informal home-based care. So we'll have perhaps a bit more time to talk about that in a future session. Patrick has asked about trade union penetration and density in the childcare sector.
No, it's zilch. I mean, you don't even dare ask questions about it. You know, it's regarded as being a sort of hostile question if you say, have you got any unionisation? I mean, it's certainly discouraged very actively.
I think where the maintained nurseries exist, who are seen as educational settings and funded in the same way as the rest of the school system, there's much higher union representation there. But also I see on the call we've got Dara from Ireland, who's been doing a lot of work around union membership with childcare workers, particularly in group settings in Ireland, and we're going to have a session from him in a week or so's time. So I really hope we'll have a chance to talk about that a little bit more, both in terms of what it means for unions to get involved, but also some of the challenges that they're facing in terms of connecting with people and getting people signed up. Yes. So Sarah has said, struck by the stats that you shared on the market share of big companies in childcare, and that concentration is greater than in adult social care, where smaller providers are still delivering the majority of care. Do you feel like that's changed quite recently, Helen? Because when I speak to people about childcare, there's still a sense that there's a lot of entrepreneurial individual women who've set up a community nursery in their area, and that still seems to be the widespread picture. But how recent is this kind of significant shift?
Well, I think I showed it in one of the slides, looked at the changes since 1998 to over 20 years to 2018, and there has been an enormous shift. I mean, that's not to say that there aren't a lot of small providers. There are about there are roughly 9,000 single or mom and pop operations, which is a lot, but they don't offer the number of places that the big companies do.
Yeah. So there was a question from Kate that looks to have been answered also in the chat, so that's brilliant. But Dara's question is around quality, and yeah, he makes the point parents are sensitive to quality, or at least sensitive to bad quality. And has there been research on the quality standards, particularly in the corporate chains?
Well, one of the things we looked at was Ofsted ratings. So we looked at the Ofsted ratings of the company chains, and they tend to be round about the same as non-companies. But of course, the Ofsted criteria are so bland as to be meaningless. You know, there's only 3 categories, and most people get a sort of, you know, good category. It doesn't mean anything. And when I think, by contrast, of the kind of work on quality that's going on in the EU, and in the literature for that matter, about people discussing really the detail of what you do with children, how you might best relate to them, how they might best relate to you, and what sort of group settings you can arrange, and so on. None of that is there in Ofsted. You know, it's just a list of criteria. I mean, of course, quality matters. That's what I'm saying. That's what I would feel extremely nervous about any of my grandchildren now going to anything other than a nursery, school nursery, and even then there are problems. And the idea that, you know, there aren't much stricter controls over the environment. So what one of the private operators said to me, one of the big company people said to me, was that actually they like Ofsted because it gives them a real handle. They think that if they can say they get a good Ofsted rating, they can really advertise their services, and Ofsted has done them an enormous favour.
Yeah. It's interesting also on that thing of understanding the finances behind childcare. In recent years, the Care Quality Commission has taken on responsibility for also understanding the financial viability of care businesses in a way that it didn't previously. And as the regulator for childcare, you know, that's something that Ofsted has had no responsibility for, but that's come out of, I think, some of the scandals in the care sector. So I wonder if that's also something kind of relevant to track across into childcare at some point. There's a question from Karen, particularly how we compare to other countries on parent-initiated nurseries. And I heard you use the term, and I've heard others use it as well, and it always sounds just a little bit disparaging, but the mom and pop nurseries, but those settings like the one I've talked about also in Deptford, where parents are playing a very critical role in setting up and running the nursery, and have then a greater kind of say over how it looks, how it works, the hours it operates, and more transparency about what's going on.
Yes, well, I think the issues are about accountability and how easy it is to tell what's going on in the nursery and how parents can have a say in that. And we tend to have this view that parents are too busy, they just want to know that it's okay so they can leave their children there and not think about it anymore. But when I first got involved in this field, and at that point the GLC, as it was, had a huge community nurseries program, as did a number of authorities, as did the Department of Health itself. And these community nurseries were all set up by local organisations, and parents were very much involved in them, and I thought they were really good. But because of the changes from supply side funding, i.e. giving them grants so they knew where they were, to giving the money to parents, not giving the money to parents, is the case. That really was their death knell. And I suppose the nearest to it now is the London Early Years Foundation, which is a charity which has taken on board a lot of the community nurseries. But they're struggling too. I mean, what I didn't say was that we actually, in our study, we compared the finances and the financial structures of a whole lot of voluntary organisations and community groups alongside the big companies. And although they were struggling, they were much better in terms of transparency and accountability, and probably in terms of quality. So they were registered under the Charity Commission, and they had to adhere to Charity Commission guidelines, which are much, much stricter than anything the company has required. So they had to state their social purpose and all these kinds of things. And although it was in some ways, LEYF said it was in some ways more of a burden, but they were grateful because it made them focus on what their core purpose really was, other than making money.
So you've got a question from Kate about the future, and the suggestion that the approach this government will want to take from their previous austerity mindset will be looking to reduce costs in the sector rather than increasing funding. And I've definitely heard some people whispering about, the way in which to make nursery viable now is to revisit the ratios required between staff and children, so that you don't have to have so many bodies in the setting, given that staffing is the most expensive part of delivering childcare. And Helen's asking, Kate is asking if you've got any suggestions about how we cut that one off before it gets on the table.
Well, I think probably the best way into that is to say staff are so poorly qualified that we can't, under current conditions, and so poorly paid and have such poor contractual conditions, we can't put more burdens on them. We just can't, unless their situation dramatically improves. All you're doing is really reducing the quality of the care.
Yeah. And I can see Zoe's on the call, who runs a really high quality early years not-for-profit setting, the Acorn Early Years Foundation, and has made the point also that local authorities used to offer some financial incentives on the funding rates, which would give you more funding if you had a higher qualified team of staff. And I know in other areas there were sometimes financial incentives if you had a higher proportion of children from more recognised deprived backgrounds, but it seems like all of that is also now a thing of the past. So that leverage or the opportunity for local authorities to play much role in shaping or determining what local provision is like, or even where local provision is, in that sense of there being black holes for some communities and having no childcare available, particularly if they're a poorer community, versus other places that have got over provision. It seems like local authorities are very much not able to be involved.
Yeah, they're absolutely stymied. And, you know, every time I see Boris Johnson on Prime Minister's questions, I realise there's no hope from the Tory government. I mean, so I think the thing to do is, you know, build up a very coherent picture of the kind of things that we think are good for childcare and keep on pointing to it. I mean, I don't think that expecting this government to make useful, small, you know, adjustments is going to get us anywhere.
Yeah, and definitely I've been having a lot of conversations with people recently, and one of the suggestions that's been made, some of the people on the call have said the same thing, is that this kind of pause and forced change in how we're living is also pushing people to reflect a little bit more on their expectations of how they will balance work and caring responsibilities and those other things. So now might be, although it's a very bleak time, the opportunity also to be thinking about what does that positive picture of change look like in the future. Yeah, and Karen's made the point that, you know, this growth towards some of those mega nurseries with 100+ kids, which is also one of the economies of scale that some of the bigger chains are moving towards, is a very difficult offer, I think, for parents who are concerned, particularly around COVID at the moment. That might feel like a thing of the past rather than a thing of the future.
Yes, well, there are, I can't quite remember how many there are, but there are a lot of nurseries that, well, a considerable number that have 300+ children.
Right. Wow. My 26 places down in Deptford seems like a drop in the ocean. So I'm really conscious of the time and everyone's involvement. I'm really, really grateful. I'm going to wrap up now. As I said, we've got some future sessions coming up that pick up some of the points that we've raised already and will give us a chance to talk in more depth. I'm asking everyone to register for the sessions just so it gives me a bit of an idea of how many people are joining. It's a control thing, I'm afraid. But if you're able to, I'll circulate the list again. But just to whet your appetite, we've got Matt Dykes from the TUC on Monday, the 12th of October. And he's talking about how parents and unions worked together on the School Cuts campaign, and that sense of bringing together that partnership between those employed within the sector and those parents with a vested interest in education working well. We've got Dara, who's on the call now, from SIPTU in Ireland, to talk on the 14th of October about the childcare campaigning they've been doing in Ireland over the last 3 years, and that involves on the ground organising with childcare workers, but also the partnerships and coalitions that they've been developing in order to push the campaign forward. And it is notable that the Irish intervention in the early years is so much more active than what's gone on over here. It's not perfect by any means, I'm sure, but it's a very different step that they've taken over there. And then on the 21st of October, we've got Veronica Deutsch from the Nanny Solidarity Network. So they're a new union branch that's just set up, but they are bringing together nannies and au pairs. So a really hidden group of childcare providers. And she's got lots to share with us on the challenges facing that particular sector, but also tips and lessons that she's learned from organising with lone childcare workers. And then on the 4th of November, we've got a week off for half term, although all of the whispers now seem to be suggesting we might need 2 weeks for half term this year. We'll wait to see. Lee Shannon from Save the Salford 5 is going to do a session for us on the 4th of November. He's going to be talking about how this local parent-led campaign successfully won the battle to keep local nurseries open, and how unions and the local authority came on board with that campaign and how they worked together to achieve that. So, as I said, trying to create space for us to learn from and reflect on a whole number of different kind of campaigning approaches, but also all with a view to us building our own campaign in England for better childcare. So figuring out, how we get this on the agenda in a way that makes it unavoidable in the near future, but all the way through to the next general election, whenever that might be. So thank you all for your time, and keep safe. And do get in touch with me if you've got any other questions or any ideas about other people that should speak, or suggestions about how to run this better as well. But yeah, hopefully see you all again soon.